EMS is a pretty big, pretty deep suite of products. So let's get started. Enterprise Mobility Suite. We try to always talk for give security a little bit of a basis to have this discussion, and we created a long time ago something called a security wheel, which really puts data at the heart of things. And you'll notice identity is part of what I'll call the key, if you will, that kind of cuts through a lot of the control layers that you have, whether those be operating system controls or even platform, so at platform level infrastructure, your devices themselves, or even governance and policy. It's an outer perimeter. So all of these controls surround the data, and Enterprise Mobility Suite certainly is a good set of controls for enacting around the protection of your data, especially helpful around the identity portion of things. So with that, let's kind of look under the hood at what's in Enterprise Mobility Suite. Now, its name has morphed through the years. I think Adam and I have been discussing Enterprise Mobility Suite since its infancy, right? Since I think of it individually, they had some products like Intune when it was we recall chatting about Intune back when it was in design, if you will, and then it kind of born into some suites here. The name is now Enterprise Mobility Suite plus security, I think, Adam. Does that sound correct?
Yeah, I think it's more from Secure Productive Enterprise to Enterprise Mobility Suite to Enterprise Mobility plus Security Suite. I believe that's what they've settled on now.
So its name has gone through some iterations. That said, the packaging, if you will, of it is the EMS E3 suite, which I think you'll notice on the graphic that's here at the bottom, has 4 major components in E3. There are also several components in EMS E5. This is separate and distinct from Office 365 E3 and separate and distinct from Office 365 E5. It is possible that there are a package of packages, something called Secure Productive Enterprise, which now is M365, where these packages actually get rolled in with Office 365. But I don't want to confuse you with licensing nearly as much as to know that there is a suite called EMS E3 that contains 4 individual products: Azure AD P1, as well as Advanced Threat Analytics, Intune, and Azure Information Protection Plan 1. Up at the top, Azure, it's kind of the graduates, if you will, or enhancements to what's in the E3 suite with Azure Active Directory Plan 2, Cloud App Security for all applications, and Azure Information Protection Plan 2. The pricing can be found, and certainly we're not here to sell this software to you, though through something called the Cloud Solution Providers Program we can, and we're able to put that on our paper. But oftentimes you own this either by purchasing directly through Microsoft, which is one way to get it, through a provider such as ourselves, through the Cloud Service Provider Program, or CSP, and a third option is obviously on your EA agreement. And some people have this on their EA agreement and they're like, I don't even know what I own necessarily, or I'm not taking advantage of it. But the pricing is certainly there for you to kind of look at what's available in the suites and at what price. There's a website under EMS, if you've Googled or Binged EMS E3 pricing, and you're going to get a dictated screen of exactly those items. Thought we'd kind of cover some of the columns and just kind of see what you get and make sure that this might be, I guess my goal out of this is to have you prioritize what's a project for you, what's enticing, and is it worthwhile for you to either go out and purchase this either individual suite or the software, or if you already own the software, is it worthwhile to deploy as a security control in your environment in 2019? So identity, as mentioned earlier, is a key element going into your data, right? If you were surrounding your data with a whole bunch of controls, it really doesn't matter if you're using the greatest switch and firewall if you've got default logins and passwords for employment of management of that switch, as an example. If your firewall is deployed and it's the greatest named firewall, but you've got an any statement in there. If you've got I've got Windows 10 deployed, but I've got no patching strategy, and things are kind of wide open. Again, all of these things are good controls, and they're best when they're highly implemented. But identity is one thing that cuts right into allowing access to data. After all, and I think we'll dive into some discussions later about where identity fits in as part of this map, and I'll show it to you what I mean about network perimeters in just a moment. But let's chat about the identity and access management column there on the left-hand side. So we're going to be talking about specifically Azure AD P1. Let's see if my drawing is set up here yet. No, I'll get it set up so we can kind of do a little digging in. But we're going to talk about Azure AD P1 and Azure AD P2. Certainly, just with Office 365, you own Azure AD Basic, which is not even listed here. Okay, so Azure AD Basic is a starting point, and there are certainly some nice things that you can do with Office 365 just out of the box, and they're security related. And we'll kind of differentiate some of those things with regards to then to Azure AD P1 and to P2. But as a primer, let's first jump into something called the identity perimeter. Identity perimeter is, you might think of it as a new concept, and I guess this is to highlight the priority of identity in terms of anything you're doing to protect yourself to nowadays. We've always had something called a network perimeter. A network perimeter has been done a great job, usually with a firewall or multiple firewalls, other routers with ACLs, to protect from threats from outside. If you looked at your firewall logs, you'd probably see that 80-90% of the traffic hitting the outside of your firewall is actually getting dropped. It's not intended for your network, and you don't want it on. And it does a great job. That said, there's that 8-10% of traffic that actually does need to get through, and you've created appropriate tunnels, and those are for your applications and so forth. That network perimeter still exists today and always will exist, but what's a problem is that if someone's able to get inside with a phishing email, as an example, or already has credentials to an application, your firewall is simply allowing them to pass through as what it sees as okay traffic, and is unable to discern the fact that someone is falsely using that identity. So that's problem number one. Network perimeters are starting to fail. Compound that with the idea that we now have data that's moving out onto unmanaged devices. Organizations are starting to, employees are starting to do that end around from IT, or have been doing this for years, with regards to applications that are either sanctioned or unsanctioned applications, approved or unapproved, so shadow IT. So all of this leads to the fact that the identity perimeter, which can pull in not only on-prem resources, but cloud resources and data on unmanaged devices, that's really kind of the new perimeter that people are starting to talk about. That's why we're seeing a lot of identity-related projects. And identity-related control happens with Azure AD plans. So let's kind of whiteboard quickly kind of what we're talking about here. So first of all, everyone on-prem is likely running an Active Directory. Okay, and it's very likely that many of you have an Office 365 tenant. Okay, even without an Active Directory or an Office 365 tenant, many of you have an Azure Active Directory stood up, a tenant, if you will, that's in the cloud. That serves as a identity foundation for the Office 365 services. Additionally, and how it does so is there's usually a synchronization process between your AD and your Azure AD. A couple things we're going to look at today just to kind of highlight this out. So we're going to look at controls that can be implemented here. Okay, and this is for on-prem environments. Okay, so one of the components of EMS Suite that we're going to be looking at is something called Advanced Threat Analytics, or ATA. And it's looking for strange things that are occurring within your Active Directory environment on-prem. It's using cloud-based knowledge to do so, and because Microsoft is learning every day about how people are trying to trick identities, and they're taking that knowledge and inserting it into their ATA product, which again looks at your on-prem environment. Equally, we're going to look at things that are evaluating your Azure AD. Okay? There's capabilities to look at your risk intelligence and other things. So risk IQ, I'll call this, for who's logging in, where are they logging in from, Is this a regular pattern of behavior for this user? Things of that nature. So we'll certainly dive into that. But Azure AD, as it kind of graduates up from basic into Plan 1 and Plan 2, you're going to see new features come in. Things like MFA, right? Multi-factor authentication. You're going to come up with capabilities to look at groups, okay, and actually establish users into various groups. And by being in these groups, they might have access to certain cloud-based applications. You're going to look at things like single sign-on onto other applications. After all, if you've got identity already out here, then why are you using your own identities for Box or Dropbox or Google or 3,500 other applications? PowerPoint drawing is failing me a little bit. But there's a lot of cloud applications being leveraged out there today, and why not provide single sign-on through an identity that's already out there? A lot of people are spending money to go buy third-party products for identity, One Identity and Ping and others. Azure Active Directory Plan 1 and Plan 2 is the basis and has the feature set of many of those products that are meant to provide identity for these cloud applications. So I just kind of wanted to set the scene a little bit with regards to Azure Active Directory, where it's going to come into play. And that's one element of the suite. ATA is another element of the suite. And we'll certainly talk about the other two elements as we kind of walk through here. So without further ado, let's kind of show you in graphical format using a little prettier interface, if you will, what's happening with this. So as mentioned, you have the capability to leverage Azure Active Directory to provide single sign-on to all cloud applications. There is a database of cloud applications that are available. You'd find all of your standard ones, your ADP, your Box, your Concur, your Workforce. All your standard applications tend to have already been provisioning capabilities through Azure AD. And these capabilities will range from, yes, we can provide single sign-on, fully, SAML-based sign-on, and it's already set up for you using certificates and so forth, managed in AD. At the lowest level, they'll actually do, so if your application is just something that doesn't support SAML authentication, it's let's say it's a more legacy application or a smaller provider, they might only provide password storage, and Azure AD certainly does password storage, where the user's credentials for that application are simply stored in the cloud within the Azure AD tenant. And at the deepest level of integration, they actually have capabilities to provision. So I could, through my groups that I set before, if I was trying to go back to the diagram, I might make a member a group here. Okay. This user is now a member, if you allow synchronization of the groups, to be a member of this group, maybe for Box as an example out here. And that can provision a new account for a Box account as part of that new user setup. So it will not only provide them single sign-on, but it will actually create a new account for that user as part of your group setting. So it's making the administration and management of some applications quite easy. I think that deep level of integration is available on maybe 40 or 50 applications, including Dropbox, Google, Concur, and several others. So single sign-on to applications in a better graphical format. Extending that application capability out into all of the applications that are available. I think this slide says 2,500 popular SaaS apps, but I believe that number is more up to 3,500. And please note here that not only is this for based applications, as you're kind of listing here, it's especially easy, if you will, for web-based applications as a whole, and those applications can also be on-prem. Okay, there's through something called a proxy server, the cloud can still provide proxy-based access onto let's say an intranet. Maybe you have a SharePoint or another on-prem based application that you'd love to provide single sign-on identity to, that can be provisioned. So the goal is to really consolidate your identity perimeter so that it's based around something that can be protected. and you don't have users with 5 or 6 logins to various systems, and more importantly, you've got kind of one throat to choke and one area to enhance your controls around. And you'll see why this is important as we dive into additional features such as MFA. All right, and some arrows draw, and then obviously one of the other benefits of providing credentials in one spot is self-service password reset. So this is a capability you get with Azure AD Plan 1, but your capability to allow users to provide some challenge questions to make sure that they're the correct user, have a second or ulterior email address by which credentials could be a reset could be sent through, but basically allowing users to control the number of calls that are coming in with regards to password resets to your help desk by allowing users to do their own password resets. Okay. They also can say, hey, I see that we have 50 applications that we have in our quote-unquote self-store. I'd like access to, I need access to Visio services this month, or to this, I need access to Box. So either by being a member of a group, maybe it's your accounting department that uses Box as an example, and by being a member of that group, they get access to Box, or they can request access to some of those cloud-based applications simply because you've got a centralized spot for provisioning and authentication. Where this becomes really relevant is in the authentication process. So as a user's checking in on applications and wants to leverage them, the user can, if you're employing MFA, which is available within Azure AD Plan 1, you have really two deployment choices. You can have MFA turned on all the time for all applications. Okay, it's basically it's an always on. And what that's going to mean is that users in all instances are going to get prompted for MFA. This includes people that are on-prem, that are leveraging cloud. This includes even on trusted domain devices versus untrusted domain devices. It's making no distinction, and it's saying I'm always going to MFA. And it does throw your experience is, we can clarify this, but your experience for what they call a modern authentication is relatively seamless. And for non-modern authentication applications, or applications that are a little older, you're going to have a more legacy experience and may have to use things like app passwords. That said, in terms of always on, we've had a number of customers that are saying, you know what, it's not always on that I want. There are certain applications and users that I'd like to use MFA. Or I'd only like to do this for non-domain joined machines. Or I'd like to do it for my iPads and Androids. Or I'd like to do it for machines that are not on my network today. Right? And you can define the locations that define your network, even if they're LAN and WAN situations, or even VPN. And a function that comes in under Azure AD Plan 2 is a risk-based score. I like to think of this, and we'll talk about it more later, but I'd like to think of this as your FICO score as a user. At any point in time, your FICO score can go up or down based on various factors, whether you took out a new loan, or your credit card bill is overdue, or you didn't pay your electricity, or you recently got married. All of these things factor into your FICO risk score. Well, imagine if you could take some of these real-time credentials, real-time attributes, and apply it to your risk score as a user. Do you normally log in at 3 in the morning? Do you normally log in from Singapore? Do you have you done any password resets recently? Do you have a strong password? All of these are identity variables, and if you use artificial intelligence to say, what is my risk score, you might be able to rank my risk score right now as either low, medium, high, or 0 risk to 100 risk. Okay. All of those factors being the fact that your risk score is such that if it's higher, you may want to imply new conditions, such as you might want to, on a risk score of 50 or higher, you might want to MFA them. Or risk score of 80 or higher, you might want to block them. So again, conditions and actions are aspects that can be introduced through Azure AD Plan 1, and risk score can be included with Azure AD Plan 2. We'll talk more about that, but that's kind of the basics of how people are employing MFA today. So I'm just going to kind of walk you through some PowerPoint level examples of what you need to think about when you're employing MFA. So first of all, think about the user, think about the locations, things like that, and think about their conditional risk. And this kind of falls right from the last slide. What are the situations you want to employ and think about relative to your travel and expense app on the right-hand side? In certain situations, if they have a low risk score, you might want to allow access, whereas maybe to a more sensitive application, a confidential sales app, that independent of your prerequisite needs, your need to be a certain role and a member of certain groups, independent of the fact that you have got a great device that's healthy, recently configured, and is on your network, even with a low conditional access score, I might want to MFA you, and with a higher access score, I may even block you. So just kind of giving you some examples of what you need to think through. This is kind of the third and final example of something that's all green in terms of these conditions, but with a medium access from an anonymous IP or an unfamiliar location, you're going to block access. So hopefully that gives you a kind of an overview of how conditional access can be employed as part of MFA for this. And that last piece, which was the risk score, it's been known by various names through the time, but identity protection is also a name for it. And in addition to being part of your conditional access, I do want to let you know that there's a console that's just sitting there out there waiting, and you certainly can have alerts set up for this console. I know the screen print's a little light there in the upper left, but long story short is that console can show you which users of mine are at a high risk and why are they at a high risk. And here I think will pop up a few credentials or a few attributes that define when they're at high risk. So you might have 4 of your 400 users in the bottom right there that are blocked. Why are they blocked? Did they recently did a password reset and it wasn't working? Who's flagged for risk and why are they at risk? So your goal is to take advantage of artificial intelligence and real-time scoring to look at the login risk of these of your environment. All right, with that, Adam, I think we're going to move into the identity-driven and have you kind of take over.
Yeah, I'm going to close out just a couple quick things on the identity and access management that Bruce just covered. One of the things that we are frequently asked about in our one-on-one discussions is the implementation discussion. What does it look like? What kinds of decisions are we going to have to make? And I wanted to make sure we also shared that in this broader group so that people understand what the undertaking is and what kinds of different elements are involved in, specifically for this section, the identity and access management that Bruce has been talking about. So who needs to be involved in implementing these types of things? Typically, we look for department leaders. They are the ones that know the different applications they might rely on, particularly those cloud ones that we might want to do single sign-on to. Certainly, company leaders in any discussion like this where we're talking about adding security features or changing the user experience. And of course, company leaders have accounts that are highly valuable to attackers, and we'd want to make sure that those are secured with things like MFA. And oftentimes, it's those leaders that can be the most difficult to get them to change their behavior. Representative user group, as I mentioned, we're talking about changing a user experience, and we want to understand what's going to be too much and what kinds of education we'll need to provide along with introducing new security solutions. And then, of course, the technology team would be involved. Some of the key decisions that you'd be looking at making in regards to this identity and access management tools that Bruce mentioned. What login scenarios are we trying to account for? Do we want people to be able to log in at all remotely? And if we're closing that lane off, there's a bunch of whole conditional access decisions we don't have to make. So what login scenarios are we trying to account for that we want to allow access to under certain conditions? Which of those conditions do we think are going to be appropriate and not create too much of a burden while also being secure? And then, of course, which applications are we choosing to enable single sign-on for, or multi-factor authentication for, or a whole host of other security features. And then just general challenges and considerations that you're going to need to think about. Impact on user experiences tends to be the biggest one when it comes to multi-factor authentication. I'll tell you that in our experience in rolling it out at Peters and Associates, I think it was extremely successful, but it came with education, it came with a guide, and while yes, we are a technology company, we also do have many employees who handle accounting, who handle HR, other responsibilities that they're not necessarily the techie folks, and so we were able to roll it out successfully, but it did come with education around what the experience was going to be for people. Planning, testing, adjusting, and planning, all big parts of rolling this out and implementing. You're going to see a whole list of security features that you can do, and you're going to roll them out and find out that either the user experience is impacted or doesn't exactly do what you need it to do, or it's redundant with certain scenarios. So be prepared that there's a good amount of testing and piloting that will go into these things. And then early involvement of the non-IT parties that are over on the left-hand side. Anytime we're talking about changes of this magnitude, they should be involved early. And then just a couple things that we have before I move into the identity data discussion. We do have a multi-factor authentication POC that Bruce can probably speak more to if other people have more questions about it. But in terms of getting you up and getting you running with multi-factor authentication, we've done this for a number of organizations.
Yeah,
And,
our goal is there just to make sure you're having a good experience. You come up with the conditions under which you want to provide access to a few applications. You put 10, 15 users in the pilot. Goal is to make sure that they're having a good experience. Again, some of the applications might be what's called modern auth enabled, and some aren't. And so it's proper to have a POC that shows you what the experience looks like. And you're going to wish that all your applications had modern auth. An example would be Apple's mail application on the iPhone, right? That was not modern auth enabled until maybe 6-9 months ago. I think it became modern auth enabled. Prior to that, it had to be the Outlook app on the iOS device, which not everybody has, right? So, just kind of walking through that, the modern auth experience is certainly a smooth and clear one, but the goal is to provide a good experience, as good an experience as possible, independent of what browser you're using, independent of what device, and independent of your operating systems, whether you're using conditions or not, and just make sure that from design through implementation that it's a smooth POC for you. So.
Great. Okay, so the identity-driven security features. So we'll go back to this chart just real quick. As Bruce had covered the leftmost column, I'm going to get into our identity-driven security functions. So Bruce's is more about that defining that perimeter and talking about controlling access. Now I want to look a little bit more at some of the data that is going to be accessible via those permissions. So one thing I want to highlight, and Bruce actually made some references to this earlier, Microsoft has what they call their intelligent security graph, and this is based on the number of their pure breadth as a company and a cloud services provider in both the consumer world and the enterprise world in terms of the types of information and signals that they're able to gather from all the emails that pass through their servers on a monthly and a daily basis, the number of devices that are accessing their services. So Microsoft is largely leveraging this, what they call this intelligent security graph, which is data gleaned from understanding the threats and the attacks that are taking place against any of the devices that might be connected, and using that data to make decisions and to understand when certain aspects might be under attack. So Microsoft is leveraging all of this on the back end. And similar to what you might see in the antivirus world, if you've moved over to what's called a Nextgen Antivirus solution, in the old world of filtering and antivirus, we're looking largely at signature-based items. So, certain pieces of software or malware that are identified as a piece of malware or as something that is a threat. So moving from those signatures and moving into something that's more behavioral based and seeing how an application, or in this case where we're talking about users, how a user performs and acts within a given environment to determine if this is a potential threat. So this is, again, taking a look at that identity and the credentials that have been used to log in is one step, but now it's the computer trying to determine if this is really Bruce Ward who's logged in, or if this is somebody, let's say Bruce didn't have MFA turned on, or let's say Bruce had MFA but was using the weaker security solution of SMS and somebody did a SIM swap. Is this Bruce Ward, or is this somebody who stole Bruce Ward's credentials? So we have this need to do this both on-prem as well as in the cloud. And we'll talk through a couple solutions that Microsoft has in regards to that. So Office 365 activity, most of our customers, I would say, Bruce, I think that's probably a fair estimate at this point. Most of our customers are in Office 365 at this point.
Yep.
Office 365 was kind of a big shift for a lot of organizations, especially from a security perspective. I think there's a lot of things that Microsoft does that are more secure, enables them to have greater security over their servers than, say, an individual 200-person company can spend on securing a data center. But there's also a lot of changes, especially to the data gathering world and our visibility to certain events. So there's some changes to that. So you want to be cognizant of what data is being gathered, making sure your auditing is on for things like Office 365 activity, who's sending an email from where, what IP addresses are accessing that mailbox. Is this a login from a Nigerian IP address, and does that user in Nigeria? So there's a lot of Office 365 activity to track. Additionally, Azure Active Directory is tracking our own activity. So a login to the Microsoft App Portal or a login to this application, MFA failure. So there's information being stored in there and audited in there. And then, of course, in your on-prem world, you're tracking different auditing events. So let me talk about the on-prem world real quick. So Advanced Threat Analytics, or ATA, is Microsoft's solution for looking at user behavior or identity behavior in the on-prem world. Authentication's happening against Active Directory. So one of the key elements of any behavioral security tool is learning how people work. So our first step in the ATA process is going to be installation and introduction into the environment as it starts to get a feel for things, and then it gets to work learning what times Bruce logs in and the kinds of things that Bruce accesses, and then I think more importantly, kind of just building this entire profile for how Bruce works, and also learning how a normal user operates within this environment. Whereas a hacker may traverse an environment, what we would call horizontally, just probing different servers, different file shares for potential holes, a normal user, would probably go more vertical, drilling down into the files they use as they work through a file structure or through computers. So understanding how these things work, and then, of course, detecting when somebody veers from their normal behavior. So there's a few different things that ATA specifically looks for. Reconnaissance activities. So you can see a few examples of what a hacker might be performing once they have access to an account to get a broader view of the environment and start kind of laying their plan for where they're going to attack or which attack vectors they're going to attempt. Compromised credentials, I mentioned a few of these, like abnormal working hours. Of course, it's also looking at things like plain text authentication being sent across systems, just things to further secure. Lateral movement also, as I mentioned, so things like pass the hash and pass the ticket attacks, abnormal resource access, kind of moving horizontally across that environment, ways that users don't typically move. Privilege escalation of users, and then domain dominance. So these are just a few of the things that ATA is looking for. This list is evolving. There is a TechNet article out there that kind of walks through more of the specifics of what this is looking at in each point that I would recommend if you want to explore this further. So that's the on-prem world. That's the kinds of things that we're looking at. Let's come back to the cloud world. So I mentioned we've got this auditing in Office 365. There's a number of different elements we can look at, like who's sending emails to where and who's accessing certain email accounts, what IP addresses. So we're gathering all of this data. There's a tool in Office 365, and I believe if you are an O365 E5 owner, yep, you have this for Office 365. So Microsoft calls it Cloud App Security. I will call it something called a maybe a CASB Lite. And if you're familiar with CASB, it's Cloud Access Security Broker. It is becoming more popular, though we haven't fully seen that industry mature yet. But the idea behind this is we've got all these things in cloud applications. Let's specifically talk about Office 365, then I'll expand this conversation. But we've got all this data going out to OneDrive, going out to SharePoint. What type of data is this? What kind of governance do we have around the data that's going out there? Is there PCI data that we're concerned about? Is there other compliance data we're concerned about? Is there just a big mass deletion that I care about? Mass deletion is often how a hacker is going to cover their tracks. Often it's how a hacker might even start an attack if their attack is simply to disrupt. So Cloud App Security, specifically for Office 365, is looking at activities that should concern us in terms of how a user is behaving and interacting with data stored in an application, but also the types of data that is in that application, or the types of files that are, say, being stored in OneDrive or stored in SharePoint. These are the types of things that we are elevating in Cloud App Security as part of our data-driven security practice. The other piece of this, Cloud App Security at a broader level for those third-party non-Microsoft applications. So are you using Salesforce? Are you using Box? Are you using Dropbox? Let's start looking at governance around there. And I see a file, this picks up a file that's been sent to Dropbox that has, say, social security numbers. This is the kind of thing I don't want stored in Dropbox. You can lock that file, you can remove the file, you can prevent any access to the file except by the person who uploaded it until they are removing it. So there's a lot of different rules you can build around this, and really this does encompass a discovery method to see what's being passed out there, an investigative control, and then these governance controls that take action prior to that take action on these files or the data that's being stored out there in order to move you back to more compliance or a more secure form.
Yeah, policy with teeth, I'll call it. Yep.
So in our world, I'll just mention from an offer perspective, so a lot of the data that we're grabbing from here, this is kind of the detect and respond phase of the NIST cybersecurity framework. This can be fed into our SIM as a service that we have. So this is detecting, in addition to all of the user stuff we talked about, combining it with logs that we're seeing from the firewalls. Is it increased activity from certain countries that we are concerned about, or that we
really don't need activity with, that should maybe be closed off completely. Is there something weird happening on this externally facing server? So combining all of this data into something a little bit more actionable. The other thing that I'll mention that I don't have a slide for in here is we do have a service, a weekly security audit for Office 365 that looks specifically at these Office 365 things, like where are logins coming from? Are there new inbox rules that's forwarding data outside of your mailboxes? Looking at these on a regular basis and making sure that we're on top of these changes. And when we see that there is a login from India and we don't have anybody in India currently, nobody's on vacation there, that's an indication that there's been a compromise to the account. And so when we talk about that reconnaissance phase that's going on, that's a real step that hackers take. And so they'll access the mailbox, and they take some time to learn about you. So the time from where we can realistically detect that, from say a first login, or we can it greatly increases our chances of preventing a damaging attack when you do that. So that's another service we have. If you're interested in that, reach out to me after this, drop a note in the IM window, and I'll follow up. And we've got a free trial that we can put you on. So recentering back on the implementation piece of this. So identity-driven security is what we just spoke on. So from an implementation perspective, who needs to be involved? Again, department leaders. We're talking about applications that that their departments use, whether it's Salesforce or whether it's, say, the marketing department using Dropbox for files, as much as it might upset the IT department to have it kind of out of our control. It's not always up to us what other departments use. So when we're talking about these third-party applications, we need these other departments involved. Of course, the company leaders, compliance and governance teams. So if you are a regulated organization or you do have a compliance team in place, they probably have an idea of what policies we need to be building. And then, of course, the IT team. And then from a decision perspective, what activities are we concerned about? Who should be alerted, and what kinds of actions do we want to take? Those are just a few of the pieces that we'd be thinking about while we build this solution. And then challenges. So data and alert overload is one of the bigger challenges, is that we've now created another dashboard that somebody has to check. What type of actions do we want to make sure we're setting up on here to make this data as valuable to us as possible without overburdening us. And then understanding different alert thresholds, how we have things configured, and then total app coverage. So how many of the applications that we're using regularly can we put these governance rules in place on? And if there are applications we can't, how are those being covered? How are those being accounted for?
Yeah, and I think generally our findings are that ATA is relatively light from a barking perspective, right? It's findings because it's gone through some learnings. It tends to be pretty light with regards to the number of alerts that an ATA system is going to send out. Assuming you're not under a compromise situation, but you're going to find some things in the beginning, and then it's going to go a little bit quiet, maybe 3 to 50 alerts per week, depending on probably your size. But an organization like us, we're getting maybe 2-3 alerts a week. Machines that came out of the domain that went back in, you probably want to know about that, right? It just, even if there's no action item, it's still something good to record. So, cloud app security, there's more work to that, right? That's, there's a lot of things going on in Office 365 and certainly more actions and insights that you might need to be taking, because right now people are a little bit blind. So, all right. Adam, so I'm going to jump into the third element of managed mobile productivity, and effectively this is the layer, second to outermost layer there with regards to your mobile apps and devices tend to be towards the outer layer, right? They're not your platform, they're not your infrastructure, they're really kind of getting out to what people end up using. And, to this degree, let's kind of give it context again back to our frame. But at the same time, we're going to move this presentation along a little bit and just talk about Intune. And here you can see Intune, there is no graduate, if you will, in the E5 suite. Intune is all-encompassing. It's included in E3. And most importantly, it's important that you understand there are 3 capabilities it has, and they're somewhat independent of each other. One is MAM, right, application management, and that's its most popular use today. A second one is mobile device management, and that's where you're a fully enrolled device, and you can kind of compare feature by feature, where it does well and falls down versus the other mobile device management products that are out there today, and there are numerous ones, right? And then third is PC management, PC and Mac management, I should list. It actually has a lot of capabilities that are in the System Center Configuration, or SCCM product, even though it's cloud-born. It can deploy software. It can meter applications. It can things of that nature. It can do inventory tracking. So there's a lot of features for full PC management if desired too. And again, each of these three are kind of distinct. So let's dive into some of those relatively quickly and just kind of give you an overview of Intune, just so you're aware of this portion of the EMS suite. So Intune is cloud only. It's cloud-born. There's no infrastructure, I guess, relative to it. It was built by the SCCM team at Microsoft. It was not an acquired product. This is homegrown from Microsoft over the years. Been out for, I don't know, Adam, you and I have been chatting Intune for 6-7 years, something of that nature. So relatively mature.
Yep.
Yeah. And kind of listing out in graphical format are the three capabilities. MDM for managing the actual device. Who manages an actual device in a mobile device scenario or in a BYOD scenario? Do you really want to manage the device? No, maybe you want to know about the user and maybe know that they have a certain iOS level, but you're not going to lock out their camera. You're not going to control what wireless they connect to. You might be looking more for mobile application management, where you want to roll out your key applications to their BYOD device. You want to make sure that data that's in that application isn't copied outside of that application. That's mobile application management. And third is managing the PC or Mac using Intune, using SCCM, or both. And you have capabilities there, but the Intune license actually gives you the SCCM CAL also. So if you so choose to deploy SCCM either in combination or as an alternative to Intune, you can. And again, that's something where you kind of need to look at what features you need. If you need image deployment, you might be looking at SCCM. If you need image control, you might just be looking at Intune. And Adam, the feature is from Intune?
Autopilot.
Autopilot, yeah, thank you. So mobile application management, probably the least understood aspect of Intune. This means that the device is not enrolled, right? You have not enrolled this device. However, the user has registered this device. So there's a difference in that there's no device control with MAM, and it's a light touch, I'll call it, but yet it's enough to know that if a application is deployed to the machine, whether it be an iPad, an Android device, even a Windows 10 device, you have control over that application. They're called a managed application. You can prevent where things are copied to. You could even control copy and paste, not allow data to go outside of that perimeter. And equally, you can pull back that application without destroying the other applications. So this is, I'll call it partial wipe. I'll call it sandboxing. You give it the term you'd like to compare it into the world that you know, but mobile application management is all of those things. Sandboxing, isolation, application control without necessarily device control. Whereas mobile device management, the larger one, requires an enrollment where a user's logging in using those Azure AD credentials that we provided earlier. There's probably a little portal page for your organization where your applications that you would like to deploy out to these mobile devices is there. These might come directly from the iTunes or from the App Store or Google Play, and it's a subset of applications that you find to be valuable organizational applications. You can provision those applications out there. You can manage and protect those applications just like with mobile device management, and you've also got full device control also to employ policies, and you can do bulk enrollment and other things of that nature. So, and then PC and Mac management, I think we have just listed out a chart of some things that might be big differentiators for you between, again, using Intune, which is cloud-only, very light infrastructure, versus having to deploy an on-prem SCCM, which, by the way, we do, we're doing, I don't know, we did 30,000 desktops of using SCCM last year. So we do a fair amount of SCCM projects, and I'm not here to tell you that you need it. I'm here to say that if in bold at the bottom, if you need power management or OS deployment, or you have different devices that you'd like to control, the richest feature set is going to come through SCCM, which you own with your Intune license. So that's kind of a quick overview. There's a more mind-numbing chart as to how either MDM for Office 365, which you get with as part of your Office 365 subscription, or Intune. Either one of them is a much better and much enhanced way of controlling mail on your mobile devices, which every organization is doing. And I'm not here to walk through every capability, but imagine the ability to control what mail application people are using, be able to roll back their mail, be able to not allow their attachments to be thrown into other applications. There's a lot of control that's afforded to you with Intune and your mail environment above and beyond what you might be accustomed to today. So I'm going to kind of roll that up. And I think, Adam, maybe we have one final slide on any deployments with regards to that.
Yep, I'll get into the implementation. Let me click over real quick. So from an implementation perspective, when we're talking about mobile device management, who's going to be involved? Company leaders, probably to some degree, as I mentioned before, they can be the toughest to turn, and their accounts tend to be the most valuable for hackers. The compliance and governance team, if there are any regulations that you need to follow, you'll want them involved to help give a little bit of guidance. What decisions need to be made? What level of control do you need? Bruce kind of differentiated this MAM, application management, versus the full device management. We see many more companies moving towards this MAM model now, where you really just care about that company data and you feel confident in the level of control that we have over that, and not worrying about getting into some of the messier legal or compliance issues that might occur if you, say, wipe an employee's personal device. What kind of device mix do you have to account for with your users? And then what applications are going to be under your control, or do you need to be able to handle? Challenges and considerations, again, handling that device mix, balancing organizational security versus user privacy, and then determining which of those applications do hold data that you're concerned about. And I'm going to move real fast here, as I know we're coming up on time. There might be questions. So last but not least in this security wheel is data, and there are mechanisms to control that data at the data level. So specifically, I'll speak to Azure Information Protection. This was previously known as rights management, or the rights management service from Microsoft. So one thing to highlight, and this could probably be a theme throughout, is that accidental sharing of data is sometimes an even larger problem than hackers, and it's or malicious sharing of data. So something like Azure Information Protection can help to mitigate that. So Azure Information Protection is security at the document layer. And so that security means that the document is going to be encrypted, and then further, it means that the document is going to have permissions on it that dictate who can access it, whether that person is internal to the company or external. It's going to dictate what types of things I can do. Is this going to be a read-only document, or is this going to be a document that I can print or that I can edit, or what kinds of controls are we going to have on that? From a classification perspective, we talk about this a lot too with organizations, especially when it comes to data loss prevention, is you do want to give your users some control to classify a document or to maybe override a default control. And so users do have the capability within Word or just on their desktop with, say, a PDF document to wrap a certain qualification or profile around a document. But you do want to give the users capabilities to do so, and you can see in this example there are different options that a user has to set within Word. The reclassification and justification, so if a user disagrees with the automatic classification, Azure Information Protection does have a mechanism for
allowing a user to override that along with an explanation, which can then be reviewed by, say, an HR team or by the IT team. And at the very least, this is a documented thing by this user that is going to end up in the audit trail for how that application and how the data within that application was treated.
And everything you've seen right here is Azure AD P1. Adam's soon going to be getting into the one feature that's a P2 feature.
Yep. So recommended an automatic classification. This has long been one of the challenges with services like rights management. And Azure Information Protection has included automatic classification, and you can see here this recommended classification. So it detected our sensitive data within this document, and it's recommending a classification based on policies that our IT team has built. So this automatic classification really does help ensuring the back-end controls that are going to be in place for user failure. Really, that's one of the big things that we're trying to account for here is users failing to follow process, whether it's malicious or it's accidental. So again, it identifies a certain key piece of sensitive data, and maybe there's a threshold on that data, like 5 credit cards or 5 social security numbers. It's identified this and said that this is automatically classified to something.
And that's where, and to be honest, so on the Azure AD, this is kind of in our implementation slide, both this one and the next one I can summarize pretty quickly. Azure AD, we believe strongly in this solution. We believe that this is the way the industry should go. Put security as close to the data as possible. Identity is obviously another big piece of it. That said, in implementation, there have been some challenges with regards to user adoption of this, mass labeling, where we are finding some traction, I think, regarding this. And Adam, I'll just move to the next slide on that, if you can, on the GD. We're seeing users classify their data, right? And so at least a labeling exercise, they might not have policies to protect the data yet, but they are labeling data, and they're possibly doing so likely due to GDPR. And the need to say, okay, this has data that we need to protect due to this compliance standard, whether it be GDPR or California's new privacy law that goes into effect in 1 year from today. We've got another law that's starting up out of New York, and there's several others. So long story short is the labeling process is certainly beginning, and people are beginning to say, this data is different than this data. And for that, that automatic classification capability is extremely helpful to be able to go out to your G drive, look across data, and start saying, I'm going to label this data. We're not going to do anything with it yet, but at least I know where this data sits. So to that end, let's wrap this up, Adam.
Okay. So I think with that, we covered off on what's included in the Enterprise Mobility Suite, and I'll actually go ahead and just resurface one of these slides here. So we kind of covered the full scope of identity and access management, identity-driven security, managed mobile productivity and information protection included at various levels of the Enterprise Mobility and Security Suite. As Bruce mentioned, a lot of these capabilities are also possibly included in, or at least watered down version of these capabilities are included in Office 365 if you wanted to start kind of playing with them and experimenting and seeing how they fit within your organization. There's considerations to think about when it comes to implementation on who should be involved, but Peters and Associates can certainly help you with that. So if you do have any other questions, I know we're over time, but we'd be happy to open it up if people want to stick around. Otherwise, reach out to Bruce and I directly, and we'd be happy to help. So thank you.